Hi, my name is Dia, and today I'll be talking about vaccines. I've just finished exploring vaccines, and now I'll be sharing my findings with you. Throughout this presentation, I will discuss how vaccines work, what they are, and I'll also explain how they're an ethical issue. So these are the main points I'll be expanding on throughout this presentation. I'll be talking about what is a vaccine, how vaccines work, what makes up a vaccine, how vaccines are implemented, and I'll also be explaining the pros and the cons of vaccines. Side by side, I'll be busting some myths and I'll be discussing the opposition to vaccines. At the end, I'll give a quick summary outlining the main points. So to start with, what is a vaccine? A vaccine is an injection of weak or dead microbes to create antibodies. Now that may just sound like a bunch of complex words jumbled together, but don't worry, I'll be expanding on this throughout the next few slides. So now we know the dictionary definition of vaccines, but what's their purpose? A vaccine improves our immune system's ability to fight a particular disease. Now, scientifically, a disease isn't just referred to as an invader. Instead, it's called an antigen. Therefore, you'll be hearing and seeing that word a lot throughout this presentation. That's all great and all, but why are vaccines necessary in the first place? Well, every time the body encounters a new antigen, it takes it some time to recognize that the antigen is an enemy. The body takes a few days to start fighting the antigen, and with many diseases, that's too late. Too much damage is done before the body begins its battle against the antigen, and vaccines help ensure that your body starts combating these antigens on time. So we've gone through the purpose of vaccines, and now it's time to understand how they fulfill that purpose. In order to do that, we're going to find out how vaccines work. So first of all, the vaccine is given to the patient, and the most common way it's given is via injection. To better understand, let's look at this diagram. Vaccines are made up of weakened or dead antigens. Sometimes they're even made up of a replicated version of the antigen that scientists have created in labs. Although the antigens are weak or even replicates, the human body still views them as the true invader. So, since there's an invader, the body begins producing antibodies. Now let's go back to our diagram to better understand. Immune cells called lymphocytes are triggered and they respond to the antigens by producing antibodies that begin combating them. So essentially your body has been tricked into believing that the vaccine is the actual disease. Thus, it will combat the vaccine in the same way that it would combat the actual disease. Now once the antigen is defeated, the antibodies break down and the body produces more immune cells known as memory cells. These memory cells remember the antigen in the vaccine and will store information to be able to combat it quickly if it ever encounters the antigen again. Now, if the body encounters that disease later, the memory cells are triggered and they rapidly begin combating the antigen. This saves the body from having to figure out what to do when the real antigen attacks. This also reduces the time the antigen has to do damage to the body because it is fought off quickly and the body does not waste a few days recognizing it. Vaccines also have three other major ingredients instead of just having an antigen. They also have adjuvants to boost the body's response to the vaccine, stabilizers to keep the vaccine effective, and formaldehyde to prevent contamination. So how is it decided when to mandate vaccines? There's no global policy on implementing vaccines. Therefore, every country needs to look at various factors in their demographic to decide whether to deploy a vaccine and whether it should be mandatory or not. It is often debated amongst society whether vaccines should be mandatory or whether they shouldn't. Many of the arguments supporting vaccines rely on scientific logic, whilst the arguments against it usually being ethical. Now, how can vaccines possibly be an ethical issue? Well, hopefully after discussing the pros and cons, that's a bit clearer. But before we go on to the pros and cons, let's stop to look at this case study. This case study shows just these steps, the steps to implementing a vaccine. Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark had to consider their demographics and their population's beliefs while deciding to mandate this rotavirus vaccine. Now moving on to the pros of vaccines. The first pro has already been explained. The memory cells remember the antigens from the vaccines, so the real antigen is fought off before much damage is caused. Moreover, the next pro, according to WHO, 2 to 3 million deaths are prevented each year due to vaccines. Vaccines also come with many economic benefits. In fact, UNICEF stated that $6.2 billion could be saved in treatment costs simply by making vaccines more prominent in poorer countries. Vaccines also protect future generations. 11,000 infants died and 20,000 had birth defects due to rubella throughout 1963 to 1965. Now, since mothers are vaccinated, these catastrophic numbers have been eliminated, and even babies are protected by vaccines. So, expanding on this, vaccines protect children. 733,000 deaths and 322 million cases of childhood illnesses were prevented in the United States between 1992 and 2014. Vaccines have also eradicated diseases such as smallpox. The last seen case of smallpox was in Somalia in 1977. As you can see in this graph, vaccines have also almost eradicated polio. Now have a look at this other graph. Before the vaccine was introduced, 2.6 million people died each year due to measles. After the vaccine was implemented, not only did the number of cases drop significantly, the number of deaths caused by measles also dropped by 80%. Now moving on, let's take a look at the cons of vaccines. There aren't many cons to vaccines, but here are a few. The most well-known con is the short-term side effects of vaccines, which includes fever, redness where injected, and pain where injected. Some vaccines have more severe short-term side effects, but these three are the most common ones. Another con is that not everyone can be vaccinated due to factors such as allergies. Another con is that vaccines contain harmful ingredients. But is this truly a con? Well, we'll get to that later. First, let's take a look at what are these harmful ingredients. Aluminum is found in some vaccines, and excess aluminum can harm an individual's nervous system. Formaldehyde is a carcinogen, and it's used to ensure that vaccines aren't contaminated during manufacturing. Exposure to formaldehyde can cause leukemia in humans, which is why it's considered harmful. The third ingredient is one that may not seem that harmful, but many people are allergic to it. Therefore, chicken egg protein helps explain the con discussed on the previous slide, that not everyone can be vaccinated. Now, is this truly a big con? Vaccines don't contain an overdose of aluminum. Formaldehyde is also found in household products and preservatives. Moreover, there's more formaldehyde naturally residing in the human body than in any vaccine. So that's some food for thought. Moving on, let's go through a video that will counter the first con. This video will explain how the side effects of vaccines are better than the disease's symptoms.
It's complicated to directly compare the side effects of vaccines with the effects of diseases. For example, hundreds of millions of people are vaccinated against measles in the West, but there were only 83,000 cases in Europe in 2018. So with numbers that different, even mild side effects can seem scary compared to the bad effects of a disease that we don't see as much anymore. Before the measles vaccine became available in 1963, virtually every single child on Earth contracted measles at some point. An estimated 135 million cases in the 1950s, every single year. But are measles really that dangerous in the year 2019 with our advanced healthcare and new technologies? Are they worth the risk of vaccine side effects? Let's do a thought experiment based on real numbers. Imagine a developed country in a parallel world. It has good healthcare, but people stop vaccinating. In this scenario, let's say 10 million children caught measles. What happens? 9,800,000 or 98% will get a high fever and a very unpleasant rash. Up to 800,000 of them, or 8%, will suffer from dangerous diarrhea. 700,000 or 7% will suffer from an ear infection which can lead to permanent hearing loss. 600,000 kids, or 6%, will suffer from pneumonia, the most dangerous effect of measles. It alone will kill 12,000 children. Up to 10,000 children, or 0.1%, will get encephalitis. 2,500 kids, or 0.025%, will contract SSPE, a disease where the measles virus lingers in their brain and kills them a few years later. Taken together, around 2.5 million children will suffer from somewhat serious effects from measles, and about 20,000 children will be killed by measles. It doesn't stop here though. The kids who beat measles are left with a severely damaged immune system that needs a lot of time to regenerate. Time for other diseases to do further damage. Aside from that, what's almost guaranteed is that your kids will have a really bad time for about 2 weeks. Okay, but what about vaccines? It's only fair to look at these risks too. So let's repeat our thought experiment, but this time we vaccinate 10 million children with MMR. What would theoretically happen here? After being vaccinated, of our 10 million kids, around 10% get a fever. 500,000 or 5% will get a mild rash. Up to 100 or 0.001% might have a serious allergic reaction and will have to be treated. Up to 10 boys or 0.0001% might get inflammation of the genitalia. And up to 10 kids in total, or 0.0001%, might get the most serious side effect, encephalitis. So we vaccinated 10 million kids. In total, around 120 had side effects that were somewhat serious.
So through that video, we saw how side effects are a con of vaccines, but they're still much better than the actual disease symptoms. Now, we've understood 2 of the cons and how they don't outweigh the pros. So let's move on to the third con. A common argument against vaccines is that vaccines restrict freedom. However, although it may reduce freedom of choice, if vaccines are mandatory, then you are not only protected by the vaccine itself, you're also protected by something known as herd immunity. Now, what is herd immunity? Herd immunity is the protection you receive when everyone around you is vaccinated, since the virus or disease will die off before it reaches you. Now, why can't you simply rely on this? Why do you need to vaccinate? Well, because herd immunity requires most of the population to be vaccinated in order for it to work. For instance, for measles in the United States, 90% of the population is required to be vaccinated with the MMR vaccine in order for herd immunity to take place. This ties into the con that not everyone can be vaccinated, because the people that can't be vaccinated still benefit from vaccines through the mentioned concept of herd immunity. Now, going back to the fact that a common opposition is the restriction of freedom, well, although mandating vaccines may restrict freedom, making certain vaccines mandatory protects the country's population as a whole. So many of the other major oppositions to vaccines are simply myths. Infants' immune systems are not too weak to handle vaccines. In fact, they can handle multiple vaccines at once. Moreover, vaccines do not cause autism. If anything, people vaccinated with the MMR vaccine are 7% less likely to have autism than someone who isn't vaccinated. Vaccines also do not cause illness, since vaccines almost always include a replicated version of the antigen, and if not a replicate, then the antigen itself is too weak to give you the illness. And a common example of this is people thinking that they will get the flu from the flu shot, but that is biologically impossible since the flu shot contains a replicated version of the actual flu. So another common opposition is that vaccines that contain a live virus can spread the disease. And this is once again a myth. vaccines that contain a live virus do not spread disease, and this quote from Dr. Dan McGee verifies that. Since the antigen is weakened, it is not contagious, and thus vaccines cannot spread diseases. Now, where do all these myths come from? They're spread on social media. Therefore, it's important to be cautious when reading information on media platforms on the internet. This also shows the importance of turning to credible sources for information, especially when you're looking for information about vaccines. Now, as a quick summary, vaccinations improve your body's immunity and prepare it to fight the real disease. And although vaccines may be controversial, it's clear that although cons to vaccines exist, the pros heavily outweigh them. Thank you, and that brings us to the end of my presentation.